Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of this week, which I've titled Where's the Pottery Barn? Which focuses on homonormativity and post-gay marriage queer politics. Let's just get into it. Homonormativity. Maybe some of you are familiar with this term, but for those of you who aren't, this will be a really good lecture for you to get some concrete ideas of what I'm talking about when I say homonormative. So essentially, homonormativity addresses the problems of privilege we see in the queer community, in the queer large umbrella LGBTQ plus community, right? As they very much intersects, homonormativity talks about and sort of is a critique around privilege, particularly white privilege, as well as capitalism, so wealth privilege, sexism, gender privilege, transphobia, cissexism, etc. All of which end up leaving many people out of the movement, out of the greater sort of sexual and gender freedom liberation movement. And homonormativity as a term that has come out of queer studies is very much explains how certain aspects of the queer community can perpetuate assumptions, values, and behaviors that often hurt and marginalize or erase many folks within the LGBTQ plus community, as well as those with whom the community should be working in solidarity because they share multiple oppressions together. It also describes the perpetuation, assumption, reproduction that queer people want to be part of the dominant mainstream heterosexual cisgender culture, and the way in which our society rewards those that do so. Rewards the ones who do fit as neatly into that box as possible, identifying them as the most worthy and deserving of visibility and rights. Before we can actually really get more in depth into homonormativity, we do have to go back to heteronormativity because it's part of the same branch, essentially. So again, heteronormativity assumes that that every person is straight, right? Because straight or being heterosexual is the norm. And not just that they're heterosexual, but that their behavior, sexual orientation, and gender identity are in line. So that their sexual orientation is in line with their gender, which is then in line with their genitalia. So again, penis equals male, equals acts masculine, equals therefore likes women, equals therefore has sex with women, etc. So homonormativity applies these same heteronormative theories to the queer community. And very much, it's not to say that homonormativity is the same as heteronormativity in the sense that it does not assume that every person is gay. Rather, it assumes that queer people want to be just like heteronormative people. Basically, we want to be exactly like the status quo, except in just one tiny little area, but you don't have to talk about it. We don't have to talk about what I do in the bedroom. And in everything else, I'm just like you. Furthermore, and this is very important, it rewards the queer people, gay people, who can mimic and be aligned to the heteronormative model as possible. A homonormative politics is very much about, again, this idea that the status quo, the heteronormative status quo, is not only the socially acceptable idea that we should all be trying to achieve regardless of our sexual orientation, but that we shouldn't challenge it. So homonormative politics is very much not contesting dominant heteronormative models and ideals and institutions, and instead upholds and sustains them, upholds and sustains the status quo, saying then again that we don't want to dismantle heteronormative institutions, ideals, norms, society. Instead, we want to join you, okay? We want to be just like you. We want that piece of the pie, essentially. And with that, then, in order to do that, you then push away other things that could challenge the heteronormative power, the heteronormative model. A great way to look at homonormativity is in the media. And you're going to be doing that in your discussions for this week. You're looking at a homonormativity model, where you're looking at depictions of queer people, if there ever are depictions of queer people, because it's still a minority. But if you turn on the TV or flip through a magazine or look on, a movie or whatever, for each of the few times that you see a queer person, they'll most likely be queer or cisgendered, gender very normative, white, middle class, gay identifying, mostly a lot of times male person. So the queer people who are visible very much fit within a heteronormative model in all aspects except just one, their sexual orientation. And even though we see more representations of different queer people in TV shows and so forth, there's more characters, more gay characters. They're all kind of the same. They're all very much fitting into a very heteronormative model of being cisgendered, very much basically following sexual ideas, gender ideas, and so forth. So they're pretty much holding that norm, except for one thing, their sexual attraction or their sexual activity. And even then, that's very vanilla and very confined, and as much trying to fit a heteronormative model as possible. And what this does is that these sort of depictions of queer people are very much, one, they're stereotypes and tropes, but they do more than just simplify and minimalize the complexities of realities of queer people. They participate in setting up a standard of a normative way of being LGBTQ+, of being queer. That, okay, the only way that's acceptable is in this very limited model that is pretty much as close as possible to dominant norms and ideals, except, again, for one little aspect. And therefore, the depiction of queer people in the media oftentimes erases, again, just the wide amount of variety within the LGBTQ plus umbrella. It also a lot of times erases trans people, queer women, and especially people of color. And oftentimes it positions white cisgender gay men, as the actor, the sort of, again, the main historical and current agents of change. One way to see an example of this is in the books around that have gay parents. So I will say this, is that children's books have come a long way in regards to depicting different types of families. And they've gotten a lot better in the sense of particularly around lesbian and gay parents. There's a lot more books out there. Before, there was just like one or two. One was the classic Daddy's Roommate, which is up in the corner. But now there's a lot more. There's Daddy, Papa, and Me, Mommy, Mama, and Me, Gal and Noah's Daddies. So there's a lot more children's books that are to talk about, parents and families. But if you look at what's in children's books, you might see that there's a pattern here. One is that most of them are white. There are a little bit of differences, but most of them are white. Most of them are cisgender. I mean, I'm going to actually all of them are cisgender. I'm going to assume they all are either comfortably middle class or so forth. And they're all participating in an ideal heterosexual lifestyle, right? Married with kids and so forth, right? Pretty much fitting that model of heteronormativity to the T, except in just one little area. And the thing is that there's nothing wrong with these books. I'm not saying that these books are terrible and they shouldn't be out there. I'm glad these books are out there. They're especially great for kids who have gay parents. I have a sister. She's been with her partner for over 10 years. They have two beautiful kids. And it's great that I can buy books like Mommy, Mama, and Me for the kids so that they can see their family represented in a book, because nothing is, I think, more valuable than representation, because not seeing yourself, you don't have a sense of who you are, your worth, your possibilities, and so forth. So again, these books are really important. But if we were going to sort of talk about how, like, if these are the books that are socially acceptable, these are the books that are the only ones that are really showing queer families, then I think we can critique it, that it's pretty much just one model, which is two parents. They're usually married. They're obviously sexless, and they're raising children together, right? And for a lot of queer families, that's not just the case. There's a lot of different configurations of families, both within the queer world, but also in the straight world, right? Yet we don't really, when we talk about, books that are geared to LGBTQ, particularly children's books, they very much fit a very conservative model around sexual orientation and even gender identity. So just to recap, the homonormativity very much works on assumptions around what is good queer identities and what are bad queer identities, or queer identities that we shouldn't be talking about. And very much, it's not just that a good queer is one that follows mainstream heterosexual society to the T, except in, again, one little area. But there's other aspects to it as well, particularly when we talk about representation, that a lot of it is white, able-bodied, cisgender, middle class, often affluent, educated, and a citizen. And what goes into these assumptions is very much that, if you're a good queer is one that is, taking advantage of capitalism to the various T. Where's the Pottery Barn, right? And very much excluding the intersections of race, class, citizenship, geographical location, so many other factors. And very much upholds this idea of this nationalistic idea where, again, that queer people are good citizens, they are patriotic, and so forth. And there's nothing, again, bad about being patriotic, but it does feed into these sort of heteronormative ideas that an only way for us to be accepted and to be seen as valid is to be as close as possible to the dominant norm. This gets us into talking about gay marriage, which has been a hotly contested debate within queer studies, queer theory, and queer activism. So when did sexual and gender freedom, which was really at the core of the LGBTQ rights movement from the beginning, became about wedding cake, essentially became about same-sex marriage? Because the thing is that same-sex marriage was not at the top of the LGBTQ plus rights agenda when it officially launched in 1969 after the Stonewall riots. In fact, right immediately after the Stonewall riots, you had this rise of the gay liberation movement, which was very much focused on decriminalizing of homosexuality as well as laws targeting gender, such as cross-dressing laws, but was also focused on creating a new world. And a world not only around sexual freedom, but social justice. So for the Gay Liberation Front, that was a big organization at the time, these issues included not only the decriminalization of homosexuality and laws punishing gay people, trans people specifically, but other issues that affected the queer community as well as the larger communities around injustice. These issues included wealth redistribution, income inequality, social justice, education equality, and racial equality. And the Gay Liberation Front very much aligned itself with the radical women's movement, as well as the Black Panthers movement. And it was very much about making a common cause with all oppressed peoples and a commitment to a larger project of political change. But the radical gay liberation movement got pushed to the bottom of the LGBTQ rights agenda. It doesn't mean to say that it's, and I put the timeline 70s to 80s being only when it was like the most visible. It doesn't mean that it went away. And in fact, we're going to be talking about next week about how queer politics have kind of rebirthed the gay liberation movement. That never really went away, but definitely was overshadowed by what would be considered the mainstream gay and lesbian rights movement, which very much focused on this idea that rather than trying to destroy the old order, old institutions, to build something new, why don't we just work with what we have and create greater inclusion for LGBT persons and more L and G persons in America? The T was very much suppressed. So this quickly evolved into marriage equality as the major goal of the LGBTQ plus rights movement, the mainstream movement. Because very much the emphasis of the mainstream gay and lesbian rights movement was on coming out in gay rights. They did expect and demand acceptance for who they were, and their goals were very much around ending discrimination, invisibility, and other sort of forms of discrimination in the church and the military and so forth. But it was very much about seeing and being treated as full citizens instead of second-class citizens in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the United States, which gay people have been treated as second-class citizens. And marriage was the perfect way to fight for the legal equity in the law. Because, so with the gay and lesbian rights movement, they did work very hard in getting anti-discrimination clauses onto the books for labor and slowly for the military, though those rights have been slowly being taken away or quickly being taken away right now. But marriage became this kind of ultimate goal, because with marriage, you can be treated as a full citizen, where this law is then applied to all other aspects, because so much of our society is based on marriage laws, laws around property, laws around access to insurances, health, access to education can very much depend on your marriage status. And to be fair, a lot of LGBT couples were experiencing incredible amounts of difficulties and hardships, just heartbreaking stories, because they could not be protected by the law in regards to their union. So you have children being taken away from, gay partners, right? Or from their the other partner's family if their partner died, to partners not being able to inherit their other partner's property, to just many other heartbreaking stories. So again, it's not to say that the fight for gay marriage is a terrible fight. In fact, it's a fight for the protection of people's lives. But it did become the overwhelming sort of fight. The sort of a lot of the attention got focused onto that, and there was a lot of promises around gay marriage, that by getting gay marriage, we then finally get full equity in the eyes of the law, even though that's not the case. And that we've come to the point where, regardless or not that you approve of our relationships, by the eyes of the law, we are protected. We are full citizens, and you have to treat us like full citizens. That has also not been the case. But with that, then, there was then the fight. And slowly the gay and lesbian rights movement quickly moved to a marriage equality movement, where it became very single issue. And you had, organizations like the Human Rights Campaign coming forth and basically becoming that's their single issue of gay marriage. And, it worked. It worked. In 2015, same-sex marriage became legal in all the states. And it's an incredible achievement, as well as a point of celebration and just a lot of joy to the people who really dedicated their lives and hard work in campaigning and soliciting and just being visible and fighting for their rights. But here's the thing. Gay marriage, or same-sex marriage, as much as it has benefited so many people, it also hasn't. And one of the sort of issues that has happened with same-sex marriage is that once it was achieved, and again, an amazing achievement is something that, still is a wonderful thing to celebrate and be so proud of. It also, a lot of the coalition building that happened, because again, it was such a single driven effort and so many people got involved and there were so many resources and money. But once it got passed, it fizzled. All of the sort of coalition building that had happened within queer communities and with allies kind of became complacent, that like, well, we got gay marriage, we're fine. Love wins, right? And of course, as we're going to talk about, gay marriage is not the only issue or issues that are affecting queer lives so that LGBTQ plus people can live full, equal lives. Same-sex marriage is very much an important factor for many LGBTQ persons around, their protection and livelihood, but it's not the only issue. And with this complacency, there was a bit of apathy. And, scholars and activists are now looking back at the election of Trump and what's going on with him rolling back on a lot of key rights fought by the LGBT community for ending discrimination and so forth. As that, once gay marriage passed, there was a lot of apathy. And I remember it too, as a queer activist, prior to Trump's election and then after Trump's election, people within the LGBT community telling me like, oh, it's fine. Like, he can't get rid of gay marriage. And I'm like, gay marriage is not the only thing. But still, we'll be fine. It's not a big deal. We've got rights. And of course, that tone has very much changed within the past, year that he's been president. And it also reminds us that, have we lost our way? Did we lose our way by having sort of this singular issue for LGBTQ rights and forgetting the real sort of birth of Pride, which was very much around resistance, which was very much a radical political movement? We've kind of forgot our origin in the sort of, again, pushing out all other issues except marriage. And then we get complacent. And now, though, I am seeing within queer politics this rise around resisting and pride being political. This isn't about, though, again, my lecture on same-sex marriage, this isn't about bashing gay marriage or saying that it was terrible or that we shouldn't have it or how idiots we were to focus on that instead of other issues. But it is an important lesson not only for queer politics, but for all sort of social justice politics, that intersectionality needs to be one at the forefront of the movement, because as much as gay marriage benefits a lot of LGBTQ couples, it was very much driven by the needs of the very privileged, who didn't have to deal with housing issues, or with racial injustice, or with disabilities, or with a lot of other barriers, except that they couldn't get married, and therefore could pump in a lot of money to support gay marriage. But then once that was passed, they kind of left the scene, and ignoring the fact that the LGBT community has several barriers affecting it. And that, again, that making one issue the only issue around an entire wide variety of community is also dangerous. Because when we think about queer communities and the queer umbrella, LGBTQ plus umbrella, we see multiple barriers and incredible amounts of suffering and hardships. For example, poverty. Poverty rates for LGBTQ individuals are higher than for heterosexual and cisgender adults. And this is the thing, is that LGBTQ people are born into all types of families, including those who are poor. And LGBT people face the same socioeconomic challenges that other people who share their sex, race, ethnicity, age, and disability face. But they also face unique obstacles because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. This includes a higher risk of being homeless when they are young, harassment and discrimination at school or at the workplace. And, we can think about many scenarios of this, Think about the many homeless youth, the LGBTQ homeless youth, who are kicked out of their homes and have to live homeless, right? Or transgender individuals who are turned down in job interview after job interview for entry-level jobs, to elderly lesbians whose partners are gone or don't have partners, and they have less social security income and the possibility of losing their housing. And here's just a couple statistics around poverty rates within the LGBTQ plus community across the United States. 24% of lesbian and bisexual women are poor, compared with only 19% of heterosexual women. So already there's a discrepancy. Gay and bisexual poverty rates are roughly 13% to those of heterosexual men. According to a William Institute analysis, almost 1 in 5 members of same-sex couples in the U.S. are people of color. And LGBT people of color are most likely to live in poverty. For example, African American same-sex couples are significantly more likely to be poor than African American heterosexual counterparts, and are roughly 3 times more likely to live in poverty than their white same-sex counterparts. And LGBTQ people of all ages, right? The young and the old are particularly economically vulnerable. An estimated 1.6 million youth in the U.S. experience homelessness each year, and research suggests that about between 20 to 40%, the number is probably even higher than that, identify as LGBTQ. And trans people are 4 times as likely to have a household income under 10 grand and twice as likely to be unemployed as the typical person in the U.S. 90% of those who were surveyed in this Williams Institute report that I'm reading experienced harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination on the job. And almost 1 in 5 reported being homeless at some point in their lives. So these statistics are just, again, indicative of what the other intersecting factors that are affecting the LGBTQ individuals, and a lot of it has to do with wealth inequality, transphobia, cissexism, citizenship, and so forth. Issues that gay marriage was never going to solve. Just to wrap up this discussion around same sex marriage, the focus on same sex marriage, the mainstream sort of gay and lesbian movements sort of making this a single issue, in the end, challenged very little. It prioritized the legal sanctioning of one's relationship over real relational and societal transformation. And, a question that scholars and queer activists have really thought about around same sex marriage and the history of this movement is that, fighting for sexual liberation and equality is, of course, so much more than fighting for the rights to marriage. But how is the positioning of marriage equality as a major issue also promoting homonormativity? Well, we see it in the way that it was structured because it was very much same sex marriage rights were not about fighting against institutions, heteronormative institutions, and instead it was about maintaining the status quo and saying that we want to be a part of it. By showing that people outside of the heterosexual norm want the same things that like traditional straight heteronormative America wants, the marriage equality movement fought to gain access to this social institution by reproducing it rather than challenging it. And instead of challenging the heterosexual dominance and normativity, and instead using this heteronormative model as the basis for who deserves rights. Because what has come out of this is this idea that there are good queer relationships and then there are bad queer relationships. And that the marriage equality movement sets up the requirement that all relationships should mimic the heteronormative model standard of sexuality and family structure. And it promotes the idea that all people want to emulate straight monogamous couples, which is not the case, regardless of not if you identify as heterosexual or homosexual. And even as marriage has become, inclusive and has given rights to a particular manifestation kind of queer relationship, it is also delegitimates and marginalizes many other relationships. And in order to sort of maintain the status quo, the power structure, the borderline of what is acceptable and what is not. We can also talk about, outside of same-sex marriage, homonormativity continued in the LGBT and human rights group, the HRC, probably one of the most prominent LGBTQ rights groups in the United States, especially, has not had a good track record. It was formed out of, again, promoting gay and lesbian rights and I guess trans rights, but they've been really terrible at that for a long time until rather recently. But they've also had a terrible track record, and again, because they are very much they followed a very much homonormative model around that we need to be just like you, socially accepted, that gay people are just like straight people, and so forth, is that they also then did a lot of policies that specifically affected marginalized LGBTQ communities. For example, in 2007, the HRC chose to support a non-inclusive version of the Federal Employment to Non-Discrimination Act that excluded protections based on gender identity, while most other LGBTQIA+ lobbying groups chose to support the inclusive version. And HRC has been really terrible of connecting intersections of oppression. For example, They've been really terrible around the Black Lives Matter protests, which a lot of people within the queer community are people of color, are people who are African American. And, they very much have taken a terrible stance, or using it as that it's not their issue, and that race and violence against racial ethnic minorities are not a primary cause of theirs. And they have very much been courted and court large capitalist institutions. So they're not talking about wealth inequality or wealth redistribution, and they've been supported by very big, large bank investments. And they don't really do work on economic inequality or homelessness, which is crazy considering the high numbers of homelessness within the LGBTQ population. Their work doesn't really focus on that. No mention of LGBTQ plus prisoners, who make up a large majority of incarcerated individuals. And I will say this, is the HRC is trying, and they are listening to their criticisms, and they're trying, particularly around their really poor job of advocating for the trans community, but they've got a long way to go. And the thing is that these problems are not limited to the HRC, but are reflective of the larger nonprofit industrial complex that tends to require that more energy go into funding, building relationships with those in power, and working from a top-down approach than it does building an actual movement of change. And organizations such as the HRC, which prioritize money, power, and reforms, are very much benefiting those who are already privileged. Again, same-sex marriage really helped a lot of people, but really benefited the most who already were very privileged to begin with and had just this one issue around marriage. And, a lot of queer activists have critiqued the HRC that they should not be profiting from, a queer activist movement, and that they don't lead to real inclusive liberation and equality. This just leads us to our last point, is that for all of us, regardless on how you think about certain issues, when we're talking about sexual and gender liberation, justice, we do need to challenge homonormativity from just at least the very least of the lessons that we've learned, by how, if we don't look at issues intersectionally, if we don't look at gay and lesbian rights, trans rights intersectionally, looking at race, looking at class, looking at ability, looking at immigration, that we, in the end, we all suffer from it, regardless of how privileged you are or not. When we don't support everyone, if not everyone is being able to rise to the top, then nobody will in the end rise to the top. So with us then, a challenge for queer activists is to work from a place that supports inclusivity, grassroots organizing, coalition building, and global queer solidarity, and very much intersectionality at the core of it. And remember our history. Go back to our roots, which was very much based in these radical politics that constantly challenged corporate capitalism, military industrial complex, and the heteronormativity structure of marriage and heteronormative models. As what Marsha P. Johnson said, no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us.